Hi guys, welcome back. This is Professor Hank, and in this video, I'm going to talk to you about how to do simple text file input, right? So how in C++ you can read data from a text file, at least insofar as our textbook describes it for our C++ class, okay? So here's what we're going to go through. You're going to notice that reading from a text file is very similar to reading from the console. Right? All you're going to do, I mean, there's a few wrinkles in there, but basically, to do the actual reading itself, you're going to simply replace cin with a ifstream object. Okay, so to make this happen, we're going to need to include the fstream header file. We will use ifstream objects to make this happen. So instead of using cin, we'll declare a variable of type ifstream and we'll use that variable. Okay, so there's going to be a four-step process that we're going to follow. We're going to attempt to open the file. We're going to verify that the file actually opened. Okay, because you can't just assume that it opened, because what if you try to open a file that doesn't exist, right? You can't just have your program continue on its merry way trying to read from a file that isn't actually present, right? That doesn't actually exist on the system. So you got to verify that it opened, and if the file actually is open and ready to go for reading, then we'll process it. We'll do our reads, and then we'll close the file, right? So attempt open, verify it opened. If it opened, and only if it opened, do we process and close the file. Okay, so we're going to use the stream extraction operator. Okay, so just like you use the same operator you use with cin, and then at the very end, we'll see how we can use loops to read through an entire file. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I'll write some code. I'll give you a sample program to walk you through this. Okay, so here we are. I've already got Visual Studio fired up and started. So got IOStream here just to provide for cout statements, and we're going to need fstream. Right, this gives us access to ifstream objects, among other things, right? But we're going to use ifstream objects to make this happen. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable of type ifstream. So you can name this whatever you want, right? So maybe I'll name it in file. Okay. From there, what we're going to do is we're going to attempt to open the file, right? So this is going to be what we use. This is our cin, as it were, right? Instead of reading from the console, we're going to read from a file, okay? So then what we're going to do is we're going to attempt to open the file, okay? So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to use this method called, interestingly enough, open, okay? And so the argument that goes inside these parentheses is going to be the name of the text file. Okay, so if you know what the name of the text file is, you can just type it in here. So input .txt or whatever the file may be named, right? It doesn't have to have a .txt extension so long as the file is formatted as a plain text file. The name doesn't matter, right? It's just whatever the name of the file is. Okay, so we're going to do that, and then we're going to verify that the file actually opened, right? So we have to test it. So we can test it by using an if statement. So what we can do is we can say, well, if in file, okay? And we can just leave it at that, if in file, because if the file successfully opened, essentially this variable is going to be assigned a non-null value. Okay, so that will cause the test expression to evaluate to true, right? If it fails to open, then essentially null or false is going to be assigned to that variable, and it'll cause our test expression to fail. Okay, you can do that. You can also use the isOpen method, right? Either one, right? This might be a little bit more clear as what we're doing, a little bit more expressive, so maybe it's better in that regard. Okay, and so then what we're going to do is we're going to read the data from the file. Okay, so this works just like CN does. Okay, so if we've got a file that's got, say, numbers, okay, that are separated by white space, right? So think about CN. If you have a CN statement, okay, that's going to read one piece of data from the file or from the console, right? If you had another CN statement, that would read two things, right? If you had another CN statement, that would read three things, and so on. It works the same way here. Or you could have, one CN statement where you combine them all, right? So the user, in response to this CN statement, right, they would type something like 18, 23, 46, right? As long as it's separated by white space. What's white space? White space is hitting the space bar, hitting enter, right? That's white space. So long as the user types in stuff separated by space, then CN is going to work just fine. Now, for reading from a text file, same deal. Okay, exact same deal. It's just the stream of data is no longer coming from the keyboard. It's coming from the file, right? If the file exists, if file input.txt exists, then it's coming from the file, right? So we could do something like this, in file x, okay? So let's go ahead and create a variable so that'll work. Okay, so once this is done, right, we're going to read from the beginning of the file. It's open for reading, and it's at the very beginning of the file. And so then it's going to read the first number in that file, right? So up to white space, just like how CN would work. Okay, now in this case we're going to be working with numbers, but it would work the same way as CN does with strings as well. Okay, so once that's done, the value will be stored in variable x, and then we can do with that number whatever we want. Say, display it on the screen, right? So we might have something that looks like, the first number in the file, okay? Now, once we're done processing the file, if that's all we wanted to do was read the first number from the file and display it on the screen, then we're done, right? So since we're done, we're going to go ahead and close the file, right? You always want to make sure that you free up the resources being used by your program as soon as they're done with them, right? Because machine has limited resources. If it's been allocated to your program, then somebody else may not be able to use it, and so on, right? So it's always good programming practice to release your resources as soon as you're done with them. Now, what if the file input.txt doesn't exist, right? Well, then this is going to fail, right? It's going to evaluate the false, and so we'll want to kick down at the else and maybe let the user know that something happened, right? Cout error, file not found or something, right? You would have appropriate logic to handle that, but the big idea here is that you can't just execute this code, this attempt to read from the file, if the file doesn't exist, right? You want everything that interacts with the file, excuse me, everything that interacts with the file, you want to have dependent on whether or not the file opened. So doing your read, right? That should only happen if the file opened, and closing the file, right? Closing your connection to that file should only happen if the file actually opened. Does it make any sense to close something that didn't open? No. So if the file fails to open, you should skip all this stuff and then proceed on with your program, with the rest of the logic of your program. So right now I haven't created a file called input.txt yet. So when I run this, you're going to see that we've got that error message, right? That error message that I have under my else, right? So that is telling us, hey, error, file not found. My program tested the connection, attempted to open the file, okay, and failed to because input.txt doesn't exist, and so we kicked down to the else and we put an appropriate error message. We didn't try to process a file that never opened, okay? So awesome. Okay, so through the magic of video editing, I went and created an input.txt file, and it contains the three numbers that you see there, right? 18, 42, and 77. So now, when I run this, you're going to see the 18 now, right? Because since the file actually opened, or it actually exists, this is going to evaluate the true, and file is open. We do a read from the file, just like, or very similar to how you do it with CN. It's just that the number is present in the text file. It was pre-typed, as it were, right? So then we proceed to the cout statement. We display the contents of X, which is now, that first number 18, which got read into the X variable, and then we close the file. And of course, we don't see, the error message because the file actually successfully opened, right? And so we can read the rest of the file. Okay, all we got to do is, all we got to do is do 3 more reads. Okay, so let's create these variables. Right. So I mean, imagine that the user had typed those 3 numbers on the screen instead of us grabbing them from a file. All we did is change the source of the data stream. That was it. Otherwise, the program's going to behave the same. Okay, so let's do that. So there you go, right? So we read the entire contents of the file. Now, I was talking earlier about the white space thing, okay? So here, the numbers are separated by white space on different lines, right? But I can separate them, put them all on the same line, just separate them with a regular old space too. Okay, so just like with CN, you could have it with 3 separate CN statements, and the user could, type 18, enter, 42, enter, 77, enter, or they could type 18 space 42 space 77 and then enter, right? And it would work just the same. Okay. And finally, I'll also show you that, hey, we don't need to have 3 separate lines here. Just like with CN, we could combine them all into a single line. Okay, so you got options on how you want to pursue that. Okay, so the last thing that I'll show you here is what happens if you want to read the entire file and you don't know, how big the file is or how much data is actually in the file, right? Well, that's where loops will come in. Okay, so here's what we can do. Okay, so we know that we want to read data from the file. Okay, we're only going to need 1 variable for this. Okay, we know that. All right. Now, here's the thing about this stream extraction operator. Okay, it actually will evaluate to true or false. Okay, depending on whether or not the read was successful or the operation was successful. Okay, so we can leverage that fact for a loop. Okay, so what is this going to do? This is going to attempt to do a read from the file. Okay, and if it's successful, then whatever it read will end up inside of X, and then this will evaluate the true. So then, in the body of the loop, we can do with X whatever we want. Right? We could do something like that. Okay, and the loop will execute. Right, the body of that loop will do with X whatever we want. In this case, I'm just going to display it to the screen, and then we'll go back to the top of the loop, and it'll attempt to read the next piece of data from the file. Right? So let's take a look. So check out the output, 18, 42, 77. Now, why is the output on separate lines, but the text file is all on the same line? Because look what I did with my cout statement. Okay, I'm reading it in to X, and then I am, with my cout statement, inserting an ENDL in the output. Okay. If you wanted it to be all on the same line, well then just put a space in between. So there you go. Okay, so what else I want to show you here? Let's do one more thing. What if we wanted to add up the contents of the file, right? Well, then we could just do something like this, right? And then at the end, when this is all done, we could say the total of the file is, total. Something like that. So every time it does a read successfully, then it'll enter the body of the loop and it'll add the contents of X, whatever it read, to total, and then go back up to the top of the loop and grab the next number. And it'll just keep going line by line by line by line by line. Right? So the total of the file is 137. All right, now what if the file was empty? Okay, well, what if the file was empty? Well, then that first read operation would fail, right? It would fail, and it would evaluate to false. Nothing would be added to total, and so then we go right on to the total the file is, right? And since I initialized total to 0, you see 0. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, so where is input.txt? That would be the next question, right? So you see the file name, I just hard-coded in here, input.txt. Okay, so by default, C++ is going to look in the same directory as the executable file. Okay, now we've been doing this through Visual Studio, so that's going to be a little bit different. Okay, so I'm in my project folder for Visual Studio. You can see it should be up there on your screen now. Okay, and if you look in the project folder, oops. Okay, you'll notice the source code file, that's the name of the source code file for the program, main.cpp. And Visual Studio kind of overrides that priority, right? That standard way of doing things. And it'll try to find the input file or the text file by default in the same place as the source code file, right? Normally though, it would be located, or it would search for it in the same place as the executable file that gets built, okay? Now, let me show you one more thing, okay? And just like with writing to a file, you can also, I did a video on that where I demonstrated this, you can also ask the user for the name of the file, or you could even just use a variable. It's totally fine, right? So I could have instead did something like this. Right, string file name equals input.txt. Okay, and then instead of putting a string literal in here, you could use a variable. Okay, you'll see that's going to run just fine. Okay, but you can also ask the user. You could say, what's the name of the file? Enter a file name. Right, it's a CN file name. Okay, and then when you do that, the user will be prompted for the name of the file. Okay. Let's see. All right, so anything else that I want to show you with this? Oh, well, how about I show you why the output window didn't show up, right? It ran, we did input.txt, and then our window closed immediately. There was a leftover new line character in the keyboard input buffer. So when we typed in the file name, Okay, that got read into here, and then it just automatically closed everything once we got past the cin.get, right? So that leftover enter went into my cin.get, which caused the program to close. I have video on that too if you're too confused about it. Okay, if that's confusing, but there you go. Basically, it defeated my little temporary pause here, so that's why. So there you go. All right, so you can specify the fully qualified domain name for the input. Open's going to understand that, right? So what do I mean by that? You know, something like this. You know. Okay. All right, so that's everything I wanted to show you. If you have any questions, if you're a student of mine, feel free to drop me an email, stop by my Zoom office hours. Otherwise, hope you found the video was helpful. If you liked it, thumbs up. If you hated it, thumbs down. And consider subscribing. All right, thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you next time.